glad you came back. And for those of you that didn't see my first video, you ought to watch that one, because that'll tell you all about the house I'm sitting in and remind you, this is my house. It's haunted. I live here, I sleep here, and I'm going to be either reading or telling you stories from right in my haunted house. Thus, the title of the whole thing, The Eccentric Miss Vivien's Haunted House Tales. Well, and each time that I decide I'm going to tell you a ghost story or read you a ghost story, I'm going to try and incorporate something that I have in my house that I may have had for years that's kind of germane to the subject of the story, which you should remember. And today's little artifact that I've got is a piece of post-mortem photography. I saw it at a sale. It's a dead baby for sure. I don't know who these people are or anything about them, which is always sad when old people's pictures come up at sales and you don't know who they are and they're kind of lost to oblivion, so don't do that with your own family pictures. So this poor woman, she's holding this dead child, and I'm real impressed with having found it. And then I had a woman come to the house and she happened to collect these, and she looked at this and she tells me that this woman is dead too. And when you get up close on it, you're going to see that her hand is kind of like this. It's not cupped around her child. It's just kind of sitting there. And her other arm hasn't come around the child. Not to mention the fact that she looks real poorly, and if she isn't dead here, she's going to be dead in about an hour. So anyway, this is her. Now, post-mortem photography, as grim as it is, you have to understand that this was the 19th century, and people just didn't go and get pictures taken as often as we do, and the only way that people had to remember their dead, very oftentimes, was in a photograph like this taken after death. And we all know how quickly memories fade, especially the faces of those we love, and they didn't want that to happen. So to them, in that era, which was a very sentimental era, the Victorians, it wasn't as grisly as it is to us today. So again, this is my post-mortem photograph, dead baby, very dead woman in my opinion. Now, I'm going to read you a story. And it's more than apropos to everything being read from a haunted house. I had to give a program to some elderly women, and I looked all over to find a story that wasn't going to terrify any of them to death. But still, it's a very creepy little story, and it'll stay with you, I guarantee. Now, the name of the story is The Lost Ghost by Miss Mary Wilkins. I don't know who she is. She's kind of lost to time. I suppose I should have looked her up more, but she's a delightful writer, and this is her story. Mrs. John Emerson, sitting with her needlework beside the window, looked out and saw Mrs. Rhoda Meserve coming down the street, and knew at once by the trend of her steps and the cant of her head that she meditated turning in at her gate. She also knew by a certain something about her general carriage that she had important news. Rhoda Meserve always had the news as soon as the news was in being, and generally Mrs. John Emerson was the first to whom she imparted it. The two women had been friends ever since Mrs. Meserve had married Simon Meserve and come to the village to live. Mrs. Meserve was a pretty woman, moving with graceful flirts of ruffling skirts, her clear-cut, nervous face as delicately tinted as a shell. Mrs. Emerson was glad to see her coming. She rose hurriedly, ran into the cold parlor, and brought out one of the best rocking chairs. She was just in time, after drawing it up opposite her chair by the window, to greet her friend at the door. "Good afternoon," said she. "I declare I'm real glad to see you. I've been alone all day. I thought of coming over to your house this afternoon, but I couldn't bring my sewing very well. I'm putting the ruffles on my new black skirt." "Well, I didn't have a thing on hand except my crochet work," responded Mrs. Meserve, "and I thought I'd just run over for a few minutes." "I'm real glad you did," repeated Mrs. Emerson. "Take your things right off. Here, I'll put them on my bed in the bedroom. Take the rocking chair." Mrs. Meserve settled herself in the parlor rocking chair while Mrs. Emerson carried her shawl and hat into the little adjoining bedroom. When she returned, Mrs. Meserve was rocking peacefully and was already at work, hooking blue wool in and out. "That's real pretty," said Mrs. Emerson. "Yes, I think it's pretty," replied Mrs. Meserve. The two women rocked and sewed and crocheted in silence for 2 or 3 minutes. They were both waiting. Mrs. Meserve waited for the other's curiosity to develop in order that her news might have as it were, a befitting stage entrance. Finally, Mrs. Emerson could wait no longer. "Well, what's the news?" said she. "Well, I don't know as there's anything very particular," hedged the other woman, prolonging the situation. "Yes, there is. You can't cheat me," replied Mrs. Emerson. "Now, how do you know?" "By the way you look." Mrs. Meserve laughed. "Well, Simon says my face is so expressive I can't hide anything for more than 5 minutes, no matter how hard I try," said she. "Well, there is some news. Simon came home with it this noon. The old Sargent place is let." Mrs. Emerson dropped her sewing and stared. "You don't say so." "Yes, it is." "Who to?" "Why, some folks from Boston that moved to South Dayton last year, a man, his wife, and his unmarried sister. They hadn't been satisfied with the house they had there. It was large enough. The man has got considerable property and could afford to live pretty well. You know, the old Sargent house is a splendid place." "Yes, it's the handsomest house in town, but—" "Oh, Simon says they told him about that, and he just laughed, said he wasn't afraid, and neither was his wife or sister." "Oh, well," said Mrs. Emerson, "it is a beautiful house, and maybe there isn't anything in those stories. I never took much stock in them. All I thought was, if his wife was nervous—" "Nothing in creation would hire me to go into a house that I'd ever heard a word against of that kind," declared Mrs. Meserve with emphasis. "I wouldn't go into that house if they would give me the rent. I've seen enough of haunted houses to last me as long as I live." Mrs. Emerson's face acquired the expression of a hunting hound. "Have you?" she asked in an intense whisper. "Yes, I have, and I don't want any more of it." "Before you came here?" "Yes, before I was married, when I was quite a girl." "Did you really live in a house that was—" she whispered fearfully. Mrs. Meserve nodded solemnly. "Did you ever see anything?" Mrs. Meserve nodded. "You didn't see anything that did you any harm?" "No, I didn't see anything that did me harm, looking at it in one way, but it don't do anybody in this world any good to see things that haven't any business to be seen. You never get over it." There was a moment's silence. Mrs. Emerson's features seemed to sharpen. "Well, of course, I don't want to urge you," said she, "if you don't feel like talking about it, but maybe it might do you good to tell it out, if it's on your mind, worrying you." "I try to put it out of my mind," said Mrs. Meserve. "Well, it's just as you feel." "I never told anybody but Simon," said Mrs. Meserve. "I never felt as if it was wise, perhaps. I didn't know what folks might think. So many don't believe in anything. They can't understand that they might think my mind wasn't right." "I'm sure I wouldn't say so," returned Mrs. Emerson reproachfully. "You know better than that, I hope." "Yes, I do," replied Mrs. Meserve. "I know you wouldn't say so, and I wouldn't tell it to a soul if you don't want me to. Well, I'd rather you wouldn't. I won't speak of it even to Mr. Emerson. I'd rather you wouldn't even to him. I won't." Mrs. Emerson took up her dress skirt again, and Mrs. Meserve hooked up another loop of blue wool. Then she began. "Of course," said she, "I ain't going to say positively that I believe or disbelieve in ghosts, but I'll tell you it's what I saw. I can't explain it. I don't pretend I can, for I can't. If you can't, well and good, and I shall be glad, because it will stop tormenting me as it has done and will always do otherwise. There hasn't been a day nor a night since it happened that I haven't thought of it, and always I have felt the shivers go down my back when I did." "That's an awful feeling," Mrs. Emerson said. "Ain't it? Well, it happened before I was married, and I was a girl and lived in East Wilmington. It was the first year I lived there. You know, my family all died 5 years before that. I told you." Mrs. Emerson nodded. "Well, I went there to teach school, and I went to board with a Mrs. Amelia Dennison and her sister, Mrs. Bird. Abby Bird, her name was, Abby Bird. She was a widow. She had never had any children. She had a little money. Mrs. Dennison didn't have any. And she had come to West Wilmington and bought the house they lived in. It was a real pretty house, though it was very old and run down. It had cost Mrs. Bird a good deal to put it in order. I guess that was the reason they took me to board. I guess they thought I would help them along a little bit. Anyhow, They took me to board, and I thought I was pretty lucky to get in there. I had a nice room, big and sunny and furnished pretty, the paper and paint all new, and everything as neat as wax. Mrs. Dennison was one of the best cooks I ever saw, and I had a little stove in my room, and there was always a nice fire there when I got home from school. I thought I hadn't been in such a nice place since I lost my own home, until I had been there about 3 weeks. I had been there about 3 weeks' time, like I said, before I found it out, though I guess it had been going on ever since they had been in the house, and that was most 4 months. They hadn't said anything about it, and I didn't wonder, for they just bought the house and been to so much expense and trouble fixing it up. Well, I went there in September. I remember it was a real cold fall. There was a frost that middle of September, and I had to put on my winter coat. I remember when I came home that night, I took off my coat downstairs and laid it on the table in the front entry. It was a real nice coat, heavy black broadcloth trimmed with fur. Mrs. Bird called after me as I went upstairs that I ought not to leave it in the front entry for fear somebody might come in and take it. But I laughed and called back to her that I wasn't afraid. I was never much afraid of burglars. Well, though it was hardly the middle of September, it was a real cold night. I remember my room faced west, and the sun was getting low, and the sky was a pale yellow and purple, just as you see it sometimes in the winter when there is going to be a cold snap. I rather think that was the night the frost came the first time. I know Mrs. Dennison covered up some flowers she had in the front yard anyhow. I remember looking out and seeing an old green plaid shawl of hers over the verbena. There was a fire in my little wood stove. Mrs. Bird made it, I know. She was a real motherly sort of woman. She always seemed to be the happiest when she was doing something to make other folks happy and comfortable. Mrs. Dennison told me she had always been like that. She said she had coddled her husband within an inch of his life. It's lucky Abby never had any children, she said, for she would have spoiled them something dreadful. Well, that night I sat down beside my nice little fire and was having a beautiful time and thinking how lucky I was to have got board in such a place with such nice folks when I heard a queer little sound at my door. It was such a little hesitating sort of sound that it sounded more like a fumble than a knock, as if someone very timid with very little hands was feeling along the door, not quite daring to knock. For a minute, I thought it was a mouse, but I waited, and it came again. And then I made up my mind it was a knock, but a very little scared one. So I said, "Come in," but nobody came in. And then presently I heard the knock again. Then I got up and opened the door, thinking it was very queer, and I had a frightened feeling without knowing why. Well, I opened the door, and the first thing I noticed was a draught of cold air, as if the front door downstairs was open. But there was a strange, close smell about the cold draught. It smelled more like the air of a cellar that had been shut up for years than out-of-doors air. Then I saw something. I saw my coat first. The thing that held it was so small that I couldn't see much of anything else. Then I saw a little white face with eyes so scared and wishful that they seemed as if they might eat a hole in anybody's heart. It was a dreadful little face, with something about it that made it different from any other face on earth. But it was so pitiful that somehow it did away a good deal with the dreadfulness. And there were two little hands, spotted purple with the cold, holding up my winter coat, and in a strange little faraway voice said, "I can't find my mother." "For heaven's sakes," I said, "who are you?" Then the little voice said again, "I can't find my mother." All the time I could smell the cold, and I saw that it was about the child. That cold was clinging to her as if she had come out of some deadly cold place. Well, I took my coat. I did not know what else to do, and the cold was clinging to that. My coat was as cold as if it had come off ice. When I had the coat, I could see the child more plainly. She was dressed in one little white garment, made very simply. It was a nightgown, only very long, quite covering her feet. and I could see dimly through it her little thin body mottled purple with the cold. Her face did not look so cold, that was a clear waxen white. Her hair was dark, but it looked as if it might be dark only because it was so damp, almost wet, and might really be light hair. It clung very close to her forehead, which was round and white. She would have been very beautiful if she had not been so dreadful. "Who are you?" says I again, looking at her. She looked at me with her terrible pleading eyes and did not say anything. "What are you?" says I. Then she went away. She did not seem to run or walk like other children. She flitted, like one of those little filmy white butterflies that don't seem like real ones. They are so light and move as if they had no weight. But she looked back from the head of the stairs. "I can't find my mother," said she, and I never heard such a voice. "Who is your mother?" says I. But she was gone. Well, I thought for a moment I should faint away. The room got dark, and I heard a singing in my ears. Then I flung my coat onto the bed. My hands were as cold as ice from holding it, and I stood in my door, and I called first Mrs. Bird, and then Mrs. Dennison. I didn't dare go down over the stairs where that had gone. It seemed to me I should go mad if I didn't see somebody or something like other folks on the face of the earth. I thought I should never make anybody hear, but I could hear them stepping about downstairs, and I could smell biscuits baking for supper. Somehow the smell of those biscuits seemed the only natural thing left to keep me in my right mind. I didn't dare go over those stairs. I just stood there and called, and finally I heard the entry door open, and Mrs. Bird called back. "What is it? Did you call, Miss Arms? Come up here as quick as you can, both of you," I screamed out. I heard Mrs. Bird tell Mrs. Dennison, "Come quick, Amelia, something is the matter in Mrs. Arms' room." It struck me even then that she expressed herself rather queerly. In Mrs. Arms' room? And it struck me as very queer indeed when they both got upstairs and I saw that they knew what had happened, or that they knew of what nature the happening was. "What is it, dear?" asked Mrs. Bird, and her pretty loving voice had a strange sound. I saw her look at Mrs. Dennison, and I saw Mrs. Dennison look back at her. "For God's sake," says I, and I never spoke so before, "for God's sakes, what was it brought my coat upstairs?" "What was it like?" asked Mrs. Dennison in a sort of failing voice, and she looked at her sister again, and her sister looked back at her. "It was a child I have never seen here before. It looked like a child," says I, "but I never saw a child so dreadful, and it had on a nightgown and said it couldn't find her mother. Who was it? What was it?" I thought for a minute Mrs. Dennison was going to faint. Then Mrs. Bird hung on to her and rubbed her hands and whispered in her ear, and I ran and got her a glass of cold water. I tell you, it took considerable courage to go downstairs alone. But they had set a lamp on the entry table so I could see. I don't believe I could have gone downstairs in the dark, thinking every second that child might be close to me. The lamp and the smell of the biscuits baking seemed to sort of keep my courage up. But I tell you, I didn't waste much time going down those stairs and out into that kitchen for a glass of water. I grabbed the first tumbler I came across and pumped like a house afire. Well, I felt it and then ran upstairs, feeling every minute as if something would catch hold of my feet. And I held the glass to Mrs. Dennison's lips while Mrs. Bird held her head up, and she took a good long swallow. The water seemed to do Mrs. Dennison good, for presently she pushed Mrs. Bird away and sat up. She had been laying down on my bed. "I'm all over it now," said she, but she was terribly white, and her eyes looked as if they saw something outside things. Mrs. Bird wasn't much better, but she always had a sort of settled, sweet, good look that nothing could disturb to any great extent. I knew I looked dreadful, for I caught a glimpse of myself in the glass, and I hardly would have known who it was. Mrs. Dennison looked at her sister, then she looked at me, then back at her sister again, and Mrs. Bird spoke as if she had been asked a question. "Yes," says she, "I do think Miss Arms ought to be told. That is, I think she ought to be told all we know ourselves." "That isn't much," said Mrs. Dennison, with a dying-away sort of sigh. She looked as if she might faint away again any minute. She was a real delicate-looking woman, but it turned out she was a good deal stronger than poor Mrs. Bird. No, there isn't much we do know, says Mrs. Bird, but what little there is she ought to know. I felt as if she ought to when we first came here. Well, I didn't feel quite right about it, said Mrs. Dennison, but I kept hoping it might stop, and anyway, that it might never trouble her. We were very anxious to have you come, my dear, said Mrs. Bird. Yes, says Mrs. Dennison. We wanted the young company in the house. We were lonesome. We both of us took a great liking to you the minute we set eyes on you. And I guess they meant what they said, both of them. They were beautiful women, and nobody could be any kinder to me than they were, and I never blamed them for not telling me before. And as they said, there wasn't really much to tell. They no sooner moved into that house than they began to see and hear things. Sometimes Mrs. Bird didn't tell Mrs. Dennison all she saw and heard. It made Mrs. Dennison too nervous. Like, once in a while, Mrs. Bird would be washing dishes, and all at once the child would be standing beside her with the dish towel in her cold little hands, wiping them. Of course, that was terrible. Mrs. Bird would wash the dishes all over again, for the child hadn't held them. Sometimes little sticks of kindling would be found, laying beside the kitchen stove. They never knew when they would come across that child, and always she kept saying over and over that she couldn't find her mother. They hardly ever tried talking to her, except once in a while Mrs. Bird would get desperate and ask her something. The child never seemed to hear. She always kept right on saying, I can't find my mother. After they had told me all they had to tell about their experience with the child, they told me about the house and the people that had lived there before they did. It seemed something dreadful had happened in that house, and the land agent had never let on to them. I don't think they would have bought that house if he had, for even if folks aren't really afraid of anything, they don't want to live in a house where such dreadful things have happened that you can't help but always think of them. I know after they told me I should never have stayed there another night if I hadn't thought so much of them, no matter how comfortable I was made. But I stayed. Of course, it didn't happen in my room. If it had, I could not have stayed. What was it? Asked Mrs. Emerson in an awed voice. It was an awful thing. That child had lived in the house with her father and mother 2 years before. They had come, or the father had, from a real good family. He had a good situation. He was a drummer for a big leather house in the city, and they lived real pretty. He set his eyes by his wife. They said all he seemed to think of was to earn money to buy things to deck her out in, and he about worshipped that child. They said he was a real nice man. The men that are treated so badly mostly are real nice men. I've always noticed that. Well, one morning that man there had been whispers about was missing. He had gone quite a while, though, before they really knew that he was missing, because he had gone away and told his wife that he had gone to go to New York on business and might be gone more than a week and not to worry if he didn't get home. Then folks began to ask where was that woman, and they found out by comparing notes that nobody had seen her since the man went away. But 3 or 4 women remembered that she had told them that she thought of taking the child to visit her folks in Boston. So when they hadn't seen her around and the house shut, they jumped to the conclusion that was where she was. Well, there was this house shut up, and the man and the woman missing, and the child. Then all of a sudden, one of the women that lived the nearest to the house remembered something. She remembered that she had waked up 3 nights running thinking she heard a child crying somewhere. And once she waked up her husband, but he said it must be the Bisbee's little girl. And she thought, yes, it must be. The Bisbee's child wasn't well and was always crying. So she didn't think any more about it until this came up. Then all of a sudden she did think about it. She told what she had heard, and finally folks began to think they had better enter that house and see if there was anything wrong. Well, they did enter it, and they found that child dead, locked in one of the rooms. Mrs. Dennison and Mrs. Bird never used that room. It was a back bedroom on the 2nd floor. Yes, they found that poor child there, dead of the cold. It looked as if the mother had locked her into the house when she went away and told her not to make any noise for fear the neighbors would hear her and find out that she herself had gone. Mrs. Dennison said she couldn't really believe that a woman had meant to have her own child freeze to death. Probably she thought the poor little thing would raise somebody, or folks would try to get in the house and find her. Well, whatever she thought, there the child was, dead. But that wasn't all. The father came home right in the midst of it, the child just buried, and he was beside himself, crazed, you know, and he went on the track of his wife, and he found her, and he shot her dead. It was in all the papers at the time. Then he disappeared. Nothing had been seen of him since. Mrs. Dennison said that she thought he had either made away with himself or got out of the country. Nobody knew, but they did know there was something wrong with the house. I never heard anything like it in my life, said Mrs. Emerson, staring at the other woman with awe-struck eyes. I thought you'd say so, said Mrs. Meserve. You don't wonder that I ain't disposed to speak light when I hear there's anything queer about the house, do you? No, I don't, not after that, Mrs. Emerson said. But that ain't all, said Mrs. Meserve. Did you see it again, Mrs. Emerson asked. Yes, I saw it a number of times before the last time. It was lucky I wasn't nervous, or I never could have stayed there, much as I liked the place and much as I thought of those two women. Well, I stayed, and I never knew when I'd see that child. I was very careful to bring everything of mine upstairs and not leave any little thing in my room that needed doing, for fear she would come lugging up my coat or hat or gloves, or I'd find things done when there'd been no living being in the room to do them. I can't tell you how I dreaded seeing her, and worse than the seeing of her was the hearing of her say over and over, I can't find my mother. It was such to make your blood run. I never heard a living child cry for its mother that was anything so pitiful as that dead one. It was enough to break your heart. She used to come out and say that to Mrs. Bird oftener than to anyone else. Once I heard Mrs. Bird say she wondered if it was possible the poor little thing couldn't really find her mother in the other world. She had been such a wicked woman. But Mrs. Dennison told her she didn't think she ought to speak so, nor even think so. And Mrs. Bird said she shouldn't wonder if she was right. She was a good woman, and one that couldn't do things enough for other folks. It seemed as if that was what she lived on. I don't think she was ever so scared by that poor little ghost as much as she pitied it. And she was most heartbroken because she couldn't do anything for it, as she could have done for a live child. It seems to me sometimes as if I should die if I can't get that awful little white robe off that child and get her in some clothes and feed her and stop her looking for her mother, I heard her say once, and she was in earnest. She cried when she said it. That wasn't long before she died. Now I'm coming to the strangest part of all. Mrs. Bird died very sudden. One morning I went downstairs to breakfast, and Mrs. Bird wasn't there. There was nobody but Mrs. Dennison. She was pouring out the coffee when I came in. Why, where's Mrs. Bird, says I. Abby ain't feeling well this morning, says she. There isn't much the matter, I guess, but she didn't sleep very well. And her head aches, and she's sort of chilly. And I told her I thought she'd better stay in bed till the house gets warm. It was a very cold morning. Maybe she's got cold, says I. Yes, I guess she has, says Mrs. Dennison. I guess she's got cold. She'll be up before long. Abby ain't one to stay in bed a minute longer than she can help. Well, we went on eating our breakfast, and all at once a shadow flickered across one wall of the room and over the ceiling, the way a shadow will sometimes when somebody passes the window outside. Mrs. Dennison and I both looked up, then out the window. Then Mrs. Dennison, she gives a scream. Why, Abby's crazy, says she. There she is, out this bitter cold morning, and she didn't finish, but she meant the child, for we were both looking out, and we saw as plain as we ever saw anything in our lives Mrs. Abby Bird walking over the white snow path with that child holding fast to her hand, nestling close to her, as if she had found her own mother. She's dead, said Mrs. Dennison, clutching hold of my hand. She's dead. My sister is dead. She was. We hurried upstairs as fast as we could, and she was dead in her bed and smiling as if she was dreaming, and one arm and hand was stretched out as if something had hold of it, and it couldn't be straightened even if it last. It lay out over her casket at the funeral. Was the child ever seen again? Asked Mrs. Emerson in a shaky voice. No, replied Mrs. Meserve. That child was never seen again after she went out of the yard with Mrs. Bird. Well, that was my story for this time, and I hope you enjoyed it. And we're going to have little things inserted, and you're going to see a picture of who I think that child might have been, or at least what she looked like. And sometimes there's coincidences. You kind of never wonder how they happen, because I have a picture, not this one of the dead, but a picture that I bought to hang on my wall, and I'd swear it's that child. Well, I hope you come back, because I'm going to next time probably tell you a story. I don't know, I might read again, but I'm going to show you something else. I'll pick it out. This whole house is just full of creepy stuff. And I thank you for coming, and I thank my crew for helping to make this all happen, and I'll see you next time.